My name's Duncan Banks. I'm the director of the Further Faster Network. Gavin's here, Gavin Adams. He's going to introduce himself to us in just a moment. But what would be really helpful for Gavin, he's going to present some content in a minute. And what would be really helpful for me is if you can use the chat facility down the bottom, just click on the chat facility. And I want you to answer me a question because I think it'd be really helpful. When it comes to this whole issue in church of giving or fundraising or budgets, what's the one question you would love to have an answer to in this next hour? We've got an expert who's led churches, raised finances, taken a church from being virtually bankrupt to a church that's been incredibly successful. You've got a chance to ask the David Beckham, if you like, of church leadership.
That's question. Bold, Duncan.
That is a bit bold, but when you've got an expert in the room, you want to milk it. So yeah, use the chat. Just drop that in. What would you love to learn in this next hour that would give you a head start in trying to raise more funds at church, in trying to improve your budget, and trying to, what it's like. I was talking to one church leader recently who said, we really struggle to get people to give, and yet there was a tragedy in our neighborhood. And I asked people to give to it, and thousands of pounds came in. So it seems to me there's enough money in the congregation. They just don't want to give it to us. So how do you take those tippers who drop the odd few pounds into the pot now and again to actually become sustained givers? That's a question he asked me. And I said to him, you need to come on the Gavin Adams webinar that we're doing. So if you could drop those questions into the chat, that would be really helpful, because I think that would inform our conversation. And there's lots of people joining us. It's very exciting. I'm really excited about this. There's a great function in Zoom that says admit all, and makes it a lot easier. Yeah, so a lot of people in the chat are asking those questions, which is great. Keep them coming, because it'll be really good. Really good. Oh, mate, there's some great questions. Should I be teaching tithing? What a great question. How do you teach?
It is.
When Christians and unchurched are in the same room? Do you know, that's a good one, isn't it? You've got people who don't normally come to church and people that are regular in church. How do you teach on money? Because the church is just after your cash all the time. So how do you teach on that? Yeah. Here's another brilliant question from Tim. How do we encourage younger people to give and families to give? That's really good. Yeah, I love it. There's some really good questions. Is there a benchmark for the percentage of church income that's from giving? For instance, ours is 50%. The rest comes from other streams. Yeah, really, really good questions. What should the benchmark be? Should the lead pastor know who gives?
Leon, good question.
Yeah, Leon, he does ask those good questions.
Yes, he does.
He does. Yeah. Good. Well, we'll give it we're only 3 minutes in. We'll give it a few minutes, because there's still loads of people just joining us. How do you overcome shyness from asking? Gavin, why don't you try and answer that right from the start? What about somebody who's just shy? Because, I don't know what it's like in America. Yep. But in British culture, you just don't talk about money.
There are similarities and differences between British and American culture, but when it comes to money, it's emotional, right? So talking about it is the same, no matter where we are, what country we're in. Here's what I learned along the way. I used to be shy about it. I'm not a very shy person by nature, but when it comes to this, I wanted to be very careful because I didn't want to offend anyone. But here's what I realized is that when we ask people to do something bold around generosity, it might be the one thing that unlocks their spiritual life more than anything. And so by not being bold, I felt like I might be robbing them of an opportunity for God to do something that only He can do. And so when I started thinking about the ask more around what God could do spiritually versus, if they were going to be offended or whatever. I mean, this approach is everything. So how we say it matters more than what we say. So working on that is important, but gosh, avoiding the big ask is potentially detrimental to their faith life. And I wasn't willing to rob anyone of a deeper relationship with Jesus because I was afraid to ask.
That's brilliant. That is a great way of looking at it. It's for their benefit, not so much for your benefit.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so here's the format for the next hour or so together. I'm going to hand over to Gavin in a minute, and he's going to present this content, which I know is life-giving for so many leaders. It's helped so many people. It must have been a year and a half, 2 years ago, you did this content with our lead pastors, Gavin, and I know, talking to some of them, that it's been revolutionary. Some of them have seen a 25% increase in their giving because they've put some of the practices that you talk about into action in their church. And tippers have become regular givers, and they've managed to do more ministry because they've got more pounds in the bank, which is fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to Gavin to do that. I want to drop something now. We'll talk a bit about it towards the end, but I want to drop something now because I want to be incredibly helpful to everybody on this call. Gavin has really kindly agreed to come back for an hour every Wednesday for the next 5 Wednesdays, starting next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, February the 19th. And he's going to do a masterclass for us, a 5-week masterclass on generosity and giving and fundraising and budgets at church. All the questions you've put in the chat are all the questions he will answer during those 5 weeks. So it starts next Wednesday, 1 o'clock, February the 19th. There's a cost attached to that. This is free, but there's a cost attached to that. And I'll tell you about that at the end. And I'll tell you about how you can register for that. But I think you'll find it tremendously helpful. Like I say, you start putting these things into practice and people start giving and church starts growing. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But let's dive right in. Gav, just before you start, do you want to just give us a bit of, because there are lots of people on here that know you and know your story. Just give us a little intro to your story. What right do you have to tell church leaders about this tricky subject of money? So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I love what you guys do in this network. It's phenomenal. And thanks for having me. I love participating all the time. I get to do this several times a year with different topics. So thanks. Yeah, my background is I grew up in a Christian home and became a believer at the age of 7. And at the same time, grew up in a more insider-oriented, faith tradition in our church. And in high school, that really started to bother me because I was good friends with a bunch of non-Christians and they never felt welcome being around our church. And so I think God was already placing in my heart, how do we create a church that unchurched people and church people can both love and both find Jesus and grow deeper in that relationship. So I didn't listen to that early on. I went to college and studied marketing, got an MBA in marketing, and worked in consulting for about a decade. But the whole time I was feeling called to ministry. And so I wasn't even sure you could work in ministry with a business background. Some of you may be in that same situation now. So, but eventually found my way into helping launch a church in the south side of Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I'm in the north side of Atlanta now, Woodstock, but helped launch a church as a family ministry pastor. So over birth through high school. And then 3 years in, had an opportunity to go become a lead pastor of what I know now the term is a revitalization church, but it was a dying church and it was only 3 years old, but my first Sunday, we had $300 in the bank, and 400. Sorry, a lot more, $400 in the bank, and but a lot of potential. And I was very blessed to have an opportunity to come and lead that church, kind of through a turnaround. And we grew pretty rapidly, which was amazing to see. We doubled our bank account that first Sunday, which was even better, and we could almost pay bills. So. And then 2 years in, we're, as I mentioned, in the north side of Atlanta. There's a church up here that most of you, a lot of you maybe have heard of called North Point Community Church. Andy Stanley, pretty good pastor, decent communicator, preacher. We're about 30 or so minutes west of their location, their main central location. And we began chatting, and they asked us if we wanted to become a campus location. So I spent 2 years as a lead pastor on my own, and then 11 years working, or almost 12, working for Andy on his leadership team for North Point Ministries, helping set direction and all that strategy for North Point, while leading what is now called Woodstock City Church. Which has been a phenomenal church. I left 3.5 years ago to help churches around the world. And so I'm coaching and consulting with churches all over the place and preaching a lot and working on things like giving strategies, volunteer strategies, things like that. And my primary goal is to add intention to what we're doing. We have the most important mission on the planet. And if anybody's going to be intentional, it better be us. And so that's what I've dedicated this season to help do.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gavin. That's really good. For me, it's helpful because it demonstrates that you're not just someone who's got some clever ideas. You're someone who's been in the trenches doing this. It's great. Yeah. Thanks. So I'm going to hand over to you. But before I do, listen, everybody, as Gavin goes through, there's things in your mind that will go, hey, I wish I could press a question into Gavin here. There's a few other things I need to find out about this. I didn't quite understand that. That's the beauty of Zoom. We've got that chat button. Just hit chat, drop your question in there, as many and as varied. There is no right and wrong questions. And when we get to the end, we'll ask those questions of Gavin, and he'll give you some answers as well. So please, as we go through, don't stop dropping questions into the chat, because it'll form the basis of the end of our call. And actually, for most times, most of these webinars, these How-To Hub webinars we've been doing, people have said they found the Q&A bit the most helpful part as well. It's specific. So brilliant. So over to you, Mr. Gavin Adams.
Thank you, Duncan. If you don't mind too, look through those questions as I'm kind of presenting some of this, and pick out, because we probably can't get to all of them, but I'd love to do as many as we can. And quick caveat before we jump in, we're going to talk about, it's going to be really strategic, really intentional. Here's what I want you to think about before you see any of it. It doesn't really matter the size or the scale of your church. These ideas are transferable. One of the things I love so much about really how God has blessed me in His grace to allow me to lead in different church settings. I got to lead a startup. Had a chance to lead a rapidly growing church. I led a church with a few hundred people with no money, and that was a very different experience. Led a mega church, led in a campus scenario in a giant organization. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle on what it looks like in almost every different scenario. I know that your context may be a little unique, but principles are principles, and they apply in every context. And so I may use an example that seems like a big church example, but there are normal sized contexts for everything we're talking about. And your churches may be way bigger than anything I've ever led. And again, there are ways to do that as well. So I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a local church, and really loved it. I'm so grateful for that upbringing and that background. I grew up in a home where my parents talked about giving. That was like a normal thing in our home, not like on a weekly basis, but I could tell you several stories of how my mom and dad talk to me about their generosity and how they give to the church. And I can tell you stories about how, I would say God has blessed our family because of that. And I got to watch that as a kid growing up. So, of course, my perspective on generosity as an adult was shaped by all of that that I grew up in. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard this, or if you use this in your church, or grew up in a church where this was said, but I would hear often on Sunday morning, the Bible teaches it, I believe it, and the entire congregation would all at one time say tithing. And I remember being 7 or 8, and hearing that and thinking, I don't know what that means, but it seems like a chant for maybe a football team or something. That sounds great. And your version of football or mine, either one. And I remember the buckets coming by. I remember thinking, do people make change in this? My mom and dad would always give me coins to put in. I loved the coins because the coins would make noise and it sounded really legit, like you were doing something impressive. I mean, I remember all of that. And again, we talked about it in our house, so I kind of understood what was happening. What's so interesting to me is that that's a long time ago. I'm 50. If I go back 40 years, tithing and some of these kind of normative terms or even expectations in the church were more normative. They were more normative across Christianity. I know in UK and in Europe, you're a little further along post-Christian than we are here in the States, but that this has been a disruption in the making, that this change in culture has affected our churches dramatically. In fact, really the death of cultural Christianity is what's killing our churches. I'll give you an example here of just in my context, but I know this is true for all of you as well. If we go back 15, 20, 30 years, there was a real ought to or maybe should sense about church attendance, giving, participation. I think people felt compelled to have an answer to the question, where do you go to church? That is no longer true. When Christianity was cultural, people did kind of culturally affiliate to some version of faith or some version of religion. But when it ceases to be cultural, people don't feel the need to do that anymore. So when you think about if for 20 or 30 or 40 years, Christianity has not been as cultural, What that means is that all the things that kind of go along with Christianity also are not cultural. And I would never be a proponent of, guilt or shame, the ought tos and the shoulds. But at the same time, when people felt like they should participate or they should give, they ought to do that. It certainly helped our churches, but people don't feel that anymore, not at all. And so when we think about the generosity side of that, the real kind of opportunity for us is to think about the spiritual opportunity. Generosity is a spiritual opportunity. It is not a financial obligation for people anymore. But as I mentioned before we began, this this spiritual component to generosity is so important. And we cannot rob people from joining that journey. Now, of course, ministry takes money, and so it's nice to have some revenue. But man, more importantly, helping people grow in their generosity helps them not just find financial freedom in their faith, it helps their faith grow. So when it comes to generosity, our goal as a church is not to increase revenue, although that's a beautiful result. Our goal isn't to fund more ministry, hire more staff, although all of those things are wonderful. Our goal really is to design a generosity approach that inspires and equips people along a generosity journey because their faith and their relationship with Jesus is too important for that journey not to happen. So, what I want to kind of introduce you to is something that I call the funding funnel, but it's a system, it's a framework that can work in any context to help you start a giving journey with people and then move people along the journey. Now, in this kind of conversation today, we're going to be super focused on just the non-givers becoming first-time givers. So new givers, not tithers and all that. We get to all of that in the master class. That's, there's other strategies and things for that. But we're going to focus primarily on these non-givers taking that first step to begin their generosity journey. Now, before I kind of show you this framework, there are really two specific, we call them like ingredients to the system. The first one is that it has to be systematic. And when we say systematic, we can't kind of make it up as we go along. We need to have a plan. We need to recognize where people are today, and we want to give them easy opportunities to take their next best incremental step. Again, if I go back to like my parents or my childhood or, 30, 40 years ago, people could take steps of church participation that today look like insane leaps of faith. I mean, what people used to do normally now feels like a huge leap to take. So what we have to do is create a system that has many, many more incremental steps along the way so that people feel inspired and equipped to take those steps. So this system piece is going to be really, really critical for us. And then the second ingredient is that it has to be connected to the mission. We really want people to grow as disciples more than we just want to fund the church. And when I say that, I mean, and you may be in the situation right now, and I hope you're not, but every church finds themselves at some point at a place where survival financially becomes kind of the driving force. And here's what I mean, I was there when I took over at Watermark Church. Sorry about those fireworks, that was fun. At Watermark Church, when I took over, we had $400 in the bank my first Sunday. I mean, what a nightmare that was. And so for me, having to figure out how to change our financial position to become solvent financially without funding the church, becoming the mission of the church, that's real tricky to do. So we want to make sure the entire time that we're keeping the main thing the main thing. The mission is the main thing. So how do we do that? Well, the funding funnel really is the best way to approach this. I'm going to give you a very quick overview, but we're going to focus on the top two in this. So you see on the left, the secret to funding your church is to create this funnel that moves people sequentially and spiritually. Those are the ingredients, right? This systematic incremental movement that is spiritually driven. So to do that, what we have to do is really think a little bit more like a marketplace leader more than a church leader. I'll pull this back up in a second, but what we're really doing is focusing on customer segmentation or community member segmentation. Everybody in your church is not at the same place spiritually. Their faith journeys are different. And even if they're not a believer, they are still on a faith journey. They're just young in the journey. So how do we communicate things like generosity to people who are all over the map spiritually, who, if you think about it like a faith spectrum, they are everywhere on that faith spectrum? How do we communicate that? Well, what we typically do is preach on it or introduce it in a small group context. But the reality is that we're introducing it to a segment of people, and that segment's perfect, but all the other segments, we're not hitting them with the right content in the right way at the right time. So this funding funnel approach is what helps us segment our church population in a way that allows us to then specifically speak to each of the segments. So there are 5 segments that are represented in every local church when it comes to generosity. The first one is non-givers, obviously, and unfortunately, it's probably the largest segment that we have. The second we're going to call emotional tippers. I'll define that more in a second. The third are ministry givers. These are people who begin to give to your church, but they don't really have a plan yet, but they are at least contributing to your operational giving. Missional investors. This is our 4th category. These are people who are now have a plan to give. Now, it may not be a tithing plan. It may not be a 10% progressive priority giving plan, but they do understand the mission and they understand their role in the mission. They understand that there's a return on their investment. So they are okay having a plan to give because they know how God is using it. And the last is kingdom stewards. These are our tithers. These are our people who are sacrificially giving to the mission. They see everything they have as God's and that they can't believe God lets them keep 90%, right? These are our stewards of people. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on category 1 and 2. How do we take these non-givers and how do we turn them in to emotional tippers? So let's talk about each of these 2 categories for a minute. The first category, non-givers, very easy to understand, right? Non-givers are anybody in your active database, I'll come back to that in a second, who has never given to your church or has never given to something through your church. Now, really quick on this, active database is important. Every organization in the world today really needs to be a data organization, not just a church for us. Now, the gospel and all that is certainly primary. I mean, I'm not suggesting anything would replace that, but we have access to such incredible data today, and we have easy tools to help us take advantage of that data. So understanding who's attending your church, who is active in your church. You can define active however you want. Maybe in the last 6 months, they've pinged your database, they've checked a kid in or signed up for something or showed up for something. However you want to define that is up to you. But knowing who is actually a part of your church, as opposed to just having a massive email list of everybody who's maybe appeared in the last decade, that's not that helpful. So paring that list down to active and non-active is really important. And when you do that, you get a really complete picture of who is active in your church. And so how many of those people or what percentage of them are non-givers? Now, why are they non-givers? You see that in the motivations and needs. For these people, they really do lack trust in the church. You probably know this, but people give to trust, not just to vision. When people say that people give to vision, that's true, but only once. You can fool somebody once with a really powerful message, but if the message doesn't come to fruition, if the vision doesn't come to fruition, people are not going to be fooled a second time. When they see you're doing what you're saying, you build trust and people give to that. So it could be that these people just have a lack of trust. More often than not, they've had some bad previous giving experiences, maybe even with the church. And this keeps people on the sideline. So our goal is to understand who these non-tippers are, these non-givers are, and understand why they are where they are. Now, once we understand that, we want to move them into that second category, that second segment that we call emotional tippers. An emotional tipper is anyone in your active database who has only given to a community need through your church or to a very specific church ask. So when you think about kind of who they are or what motivates them, they are sporadic givers, but they are drawn, this is really important, they are drawn to a specific felt need through an emotional ask. So kind of connecting the dollar or the pound to the specific need is critical to move a non-giver to a tipper. So just for a second, think about for a minute, think about a time where you gave sporadically to something, or there was an unplanned gift that you made. It may only have been $5. I mean, I can think of times where I've done that. I've been on the road and there's been a homeless person, and I've sporadically, I don't have a homeless giving plan, but I gave to that individual. I have had so many moments where I've seen an ad or somebody has asked me specifically to do something, and I didn't have a plan to do it. I just did it. Here in the States, it seems like, and I'm sure there's a version of this. It may be called the same thing for you. We have the Humane Society where they have, animals that have been abandoned, and there are ads on our shows to give to the Humane Society. And here's how the ad works. It's 30 seconds of crying dogs with the Sarah McLachlan song, I Will Remember You, playing in the background. It's highly emotional, and they will say $5 a month can save 5 puppies. And how can you not do that, right? Well, unless you hate dogs, what kind of person are you, who hates puppies? And so, I mean, but think about the strategy behind that, and think about moving a non-humane society giver to becoming a tipper to it. It's very felt need. It's emotional. They connect the $5 to the 5 puppies. I mean, it is highly strategic. So when you think about why do people tip, that is really the question to ask. If we want to move people into a generosity journey, we have to understand what tips them to take that very first step. So why do people tip? Let's talk a little bit about that. There are 5 key things that can tip a potential tipper to begin a generosity journey. One is that we have to understand they are open to helping. They are not opposed to helping. They are typically opposed up front to just giving to some nebulous mission of a church if they don't understand where the money's going. But they are open to help if they understand what they're helping and why they're helping. Number 2, they are motivated initially by emotion. Now, we're going to move past that in category 3, 4, 5, but to go from 1 to 2, there is an emotional element to this that is very helpful for them. Number 3, they're connected and directed to felt needs. Again, think about the puppies. It's a felt need, and so you want to contribute to the specific need. 4, they are sporadic, which this is important because they're sporadic. We have to offer lots of felt need opportunities for them because you can't do it once and then they become non-sporadic and regular. A sporadic giver is going to be sporadic for probably a while. So we want to make sure that we're constantly creating on-ramps for these early steps. Last one, they think in dollars, not percentages. So I know some of you have asked about teaching on tithing and all that. We actually talk a lot about that in the masterclass. But imagine you're in a room where 50% of your congregation sitting in your church service is a non-giver, and you're talking about 10% giving. You're speaking to a very small number of people in that moment. Because the majority of the people in that room aren't even ready for a percentage conversation. They need to have a first step conversation. So how do we do that? Let's talk about how do we move non-givers to emotional tippers. Again, in the masterclass, we'll dig a lot deeper into this, but let me just give you 5 very quick ideas that can help you do that. I'm going to start with my favorite one. What we want to do is create ongoing opportunities, right, for these non-givers to feel the emotion around a specific need. So how do we do that? 5 ideas. Here's the first one. You can create a monthly opportunity to engage with a nonprofit organization or something in your community that's really doing good for people. One of my good friends is a guy named Jeff Henderson. We served together at North Point for the whole time I was there. I love him so much. He wrote a book called For, Know What You're For. If you've never read that, you should definitely order that on Amazon. His kind of big idea, at least for the church, right? The book is a general leadership book, but for the church is that for too long, the church has been known for what it's against. We should be known for what we are for. So what are we for? Well, we want to be for our community, for people, for everyone. So what if you created on the 4th Sunday, these are some examples of churches that I'm working with now where we've implemented this, a 4th Sunday for the city or for the South Side on the 4th Sunday, where you highlight a very specific organization in your community. You pick one Sunday a month, you brand it to create an experience around it. And then every month you pick an organization that you want to focus on. Every month you talk about what they do. You ask everybody to participate. It's one of the secrets, 100% participation. And every dollar that they give leaves the church and goes to the organization. In fact, key phrase we use all the time, we're even going to cover the overhead and the credit card fees. Every penny you give today is going to this homeless shelter or this food bank, or you pick the organization. And the dollar ask is low, $4 for the community on the 4th Sunday. So everybody can participate in this. Now, it makes a difference for the organization you're serving. Yeah, you're contributing to something outside the church. That's fantastic. The branding of this is important because now the people who are in your church, I'm sure some of you have asked, people just feel like we always want their money. What a beautiful way to build trust with your church when you are asking for money for something else and you're not going to keep any of it. I mean, Duncan, you mentioned earlier, when there's a tragedy in the community, we can raise incredible funding for that. But remember, we are a church. We're not trying to raise money. We're trying to grow disciples. So we're going to use this opportunity. Secondary benefit, these organizations, primary benefit, non-church givers taking their first step of generosity. And then this is where it gets really fun. The second time you do that, you can bring somebody from the first month's organization on stage or have a video or however you want to do it. But you can present a check to them. You can celebrate them. You can tell a story about their organization. You celebrate last month to activate this month. And then you get to start all over again. Churches that are doing this have seen 20, 30, 40% increases in first-time givers. Now, there's an entire plan behind this too that we don't have time to talk about today. We'll do that in the cohort where we have email nurture campaigns that we follow up with people and a bunch of other things behind it that can happen. But even if you didn't do any of those behind-the-scenes things, even if all you did was pick one Sunday a month to raise a little bit of money from everybody to support an organization, I think you'd be shocked at the brand that it creates for your church, the amount of non-givers that participate, and then how that leads them to consider becoming a part of that next segment, ministry givers, not just emotional tippers. So that's idea number 1. Let me give you a few more ideas. We'll go a little quicker through these. Second idea, create a capital campaign for a specific need. So you don't have to do this for something outside of your church. You could have something like a student summer camp or a student weekend retreat that you want to raise money for. It could be for new speakers in your sanctuary. Who knows? There's so many things that we can do that. But the beauty of a capital campaign, in fact, one of the things I do in my work with churches is help with fundraising for big capital projects. One of the things that almost every church misses is that a capital campaign project might be one of the absolute best things you can do for the non-giver to have them begin their journey. Now, a non-giver is probably not showing up and funding the whole capital campaign, but a non-giver can show up and begin their generosity journey. Remember, funding the capital campaign isn't the mission of your church. Leading people along a discipleship journey is. So using a capital campaign can be an incredible way to get people to take a first step because it's a emotional, often, and definitely specific, connected to a tangible result opportunity. Number three, I mentioned this a little bit as a part of the capital campaign, but scholarships for student ministry or camps or retreats. Again, it's highly emotional. It's directly connected to a specific ask, and it's an easy way to get a person who's never done something to take a first step. Last two here, segmented email nurture campaigns. Again, we talk a lot more about this in the masterclass, but I'm a huge fan, as you have probably already taken away, on segmentation. Again, if we can speak to a portion of our population, we can be more specific with that. So when we segment our active database, and there's so many ways to do this, but when we segment our active database, we can highlight specific needs and use a kind of a vision and inspiration language directed towards them. Let me give you an example of this. If you are wanting to do something in your children's ministry that costs some money, let's say you want to raise, 2,000 pounds for something in your children's ministry. Well, you could talk about it from stage to everyone. You could send an email about it to everyone in your active database. But how would you structure that language differently if you were sending it just to parents of preschool kids, just to parents of middle and high school kids who were in children's ministry but now aren't? What about empty nesters or grandparents or people who are not without kids but hopefully one day will have them? Think about how you could change your language and approach depending on the segment you're speaking to. So the more you know about the people in your church, the better you can speak directly to them. This is something that I messed up a lot at Woodstock City Church. And I can't believe that I did it because I'm a marketing guy. I should know better. But I would walk on the stage, and some of you may know this, but at our campus, it was pretty large. I mean, before I left, we had about 8,000 people every Sunday there. I mean, it's a big, big church. And so I would walk out and speak to probably 5,000 adults on a Sunday. And I would give them all the exact same message, the exact same vision. What a terrible idea. That vision and that one message probably was appropriate for a portion of them, but definitely not for all of them. So the more we can think in segments, the better we can move people along this generosity journey. So last thing, what do churches often miss when we're doing this? And we'll wrap up with this. Three things that churches often miss. One, we have to create a lot of on-ramps. I like to visually think about this funding journey like a people mover or a moving sidewalk at an airport or maybe an amusement park. We have to create lots of on-ramps to get on the moving sidewalk. And once they get on the sidewalk, they're all moving in the direction of faith in Jesus. However, if we only have, let me go back to that, $4 for the community idea. I love that idea. But if you did that twice a year, that's not enough on-ramps. You think about how frequently people attend your church. Think about how frequently the non-giver attend your church. It's not that frequent. And so here in the States, we know the average attendee is about 1.4 times a month. So if a person's only showing up 1.4 times, 16 times-ish a year, 18 times a year, you can't just have two opportunities and hope that they happen to show up for one of them. We have to have lots of on-ramps. So how are we incorporating something like this? Probably monthly for that non-giver. That's one thing we miss. Number two, I talked about this already. We speak to segments as a better motivator. So don't speak to the masses as much as you can avoid it. Segment those masses and speak more specifically to them. And then I said this very early on, but people don't just give to vision. People give to executed vision. So this is why telling stories. In fact, I mentioned this in the $4 for the community idea. This is why when we celebrate first, we can activate next. So when you celebrate what you did last month, you're creating proof for people who are a little bit on the fence or aren't sure they can trust you, that they can trust you because you're going to do what you said you were going to do. And by the way, if you're not sure, check it out. We just gave you proof. We just did it. So celebrate to activate. That's why stories are so critical. Baptism stories, life change stories. If you're going to try to raise money for scholarships for students to go to a retreat, don't stand on a stage or email the masses with a ask without a story of what happened last year to the 5 students who gave their life to Jesus, or a specific thing, and the more specific, the better, how God changed something in their life because they were there. Then we can make an ask because we have connected the vision to fruition. So, with all that said, again, there's a lot more that we could talk about in this. And again, we'll cover a lot more of that in the masterclass. But I think hopefully that gives you an overview of what it looks like to be intentional for non-givers taking a first step into a generosity journey.
Gavin, this is incredible, really incredible. If honestly, if you've just tuned in for 20-minute, half an hour segment that you've just dropped, there is some gold dust there that could radically change your church, let alone sign up for this masterclass where you go into a lot more detail. I think knowing the UK church like I do, and having the privilege of visiting so many, this idea of segmented asking is a brand new concept. I think if there are lead pastors on this call, I think most of them would nod their head that we're all guilty of standing on stage like you did and saying, just give to this thing without thinking. I would speak differently to people who have a lot of wealth, to people who have a little amount of wealth. I'd speak differently to teenagers as I would to young families or grandmas. I think that's a game-changing idea about knowing our database well enough to segment it and make a different ask. I think that's really
well, Duncan, really quick on that, if I could just put a marketing hat on for a minute, not a pastor hat, but there's a reason that automobile companies or soft drink companies brand each of their drinks uniquely because they're for a different target. When Coca-Cola created Sprite, they didn't call it lemon lime Coke. There's a reason because there's a specific segment that they are selling to. So for us in churches, we're not selling, but we do want to move people into a discipleship journey. And you, Duncan, you said it perfectly. If we were speaking to a teenager or an empty nester, we would have that conversation differently. We can't sit down individually with every single person in the congregation, probably, but we probably can segment them into some logical categories that allow us to speak to them this way. When I work with churches on volunteer growth, it's the same thing. If you stand up and just say, we need KidMin volunteers to the entire church, you're speaking to everybody, which in most cases means you're speaking to nobody. And that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really good. Thank you. Listen, Matt's very kindly just put the link so you can register for this masterclass that Gavin's kindly doing with us over the next 5 weeks. It starts next Wednesday. It's every Wednesday thereafter. You'll have access to Gavin. You can ask him in detail. The thing I need to say, there's 2 things I need to say about this masterclass. You can register there on the link that Matt's dropped, number 1. Number 2, there's only 10 spots. I mean, there's, 80 odd people on this call. There's only 10 spots. So you need to get quickly on registering for that. The second thing I need to say about it is that it costs £300. And a church leader said to me, oh, that's a lot of money. And you think, well, actually, if you're increasing your budget because you're putting some of these things into practice and you have more pounds to do more ministry, £300 over for a 5-week course with an expert like Gavin is, it's not a cost, it's an investment. It's a really good investment. So can I encourage you, please, to go to that link, sign up. Only the first 10 people are going to be able to do it. And I know there's probably going to be a lot more than 10, so we'll have to run it again in the future. But they're the only things that are available. Let's get to some of these questions. There's some great questions. Somebody, Sue's just said, as a treasurer, I'd confirm that we see different people giving to the one-off campaigns than we see the regular ones. So thanks for saying that. That's Sue.
Duncan, really quick, Sue, what's important too, though, is that not just that we see it, what's our plan to move them into the next category, right? Because it's great to see it and know that that works. Now, what we need to do is figure out how we nurture that relationship, give them a few more opportunities, and then help them think about ministry giving in the way that they maybe thought about that one-off, community opportunity.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Yeah, just quickly, Mariella's just asked if it would be possible for us to get hold of the PowerPoint slides.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, Duncan, I'll give you the PDF of all that.
Great, thank you. If you send me that, I'll send that out.
Absolutely.
Everyone, that's really kind. Thank you. Is there someone said, how do you segment from stage to a mixed audience?
Yep.
It's really hard to do, isn't it?
It is. So here's what we do from stage, and we need to leverage that stage for these moments. Instead, though, of walking up on a Sunday and saying, "Hey, and for those of you who give, I just want to say thank you. We couldn't do what we do without you." That's such a I did that for a decade, so I'll speak to myself. It's such a throwaway moment to do it that way. So even though in your congregation on any given Sunday, you're going to have all 5 categories of generosity represented, what you should do is go in each Sunday with a plan on which category you want to speak specifically to, knowing that the other 4 categories are just going to be along for the ride. And that's okay because you are targeting one category.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Can I talk a bit about teaching? One of the things that we're passionate about as a network is being outward focused. All the churches in the network are all from different denominations, different backgrounds, but there's one little golden thread that keeps them all together. And this desire to be outward focused, to prioritize those out there over those in here. That's what kind of marks us, and that's how we help churches. But when you assume that unchurched people are going to be in your room on a Sunday morning, who presume that all the church is there is to get hold of your money, how do you speak to an audience that's full of skeptics as well as saints about this?
Yeah, man, I have lived that. I mean, Duncan, you know this, but at Woodstock City Church, it was a big church, but it was also 25% full of people who are non-church people on any given Sunday. And so, and I taught on generosity and giving, biblical giving a lot. In fact, in the masterclass, I'll give you a 3-week sermon series on this to help you do that. So I did that all the time. Now, the secret, though, and I mentioned this earlier, how you say what you say is more important than what you say. So the first thing that we do to help our non-church audience not feel some of those negative emotions is we use things like the 4th Sunday for the community. If we're already building a brand in our church that we're not just here for your money, we're here for you and for the community, we're already setting the tone correctly before we start preaching about it. If we are showing stories of life change on Sundays and speaking specifically to what God is doing in our church, that helps, I think, lessen that temperature on the church just wants my money. And when then we talk about it or teach about it, we are very careful. I call it bilingual. We're speaking to 2 different languages in this. We say things like, "Hey, I grew up in a church and I used to think the church just wanted my money." I can tell you that some churches do. We're going to talk about money, though, for a couple of weeks, and that is not our goal. I'm not trying to get your money. I want you to think about money differently. And so I'm just going to tell you what God says about it, what Jesus taught about it. And, if you take it seriously, I think it might change your world. However, it's up to you. I mean, that kind of approach just makes it we're not just trying to get your money. We're trying to help you think differently about life and find freedom in something. It just so happens that generosity will help with that. Duncan, I know that you've heard this. I used to say this all the time. If you think the church just wants your money, I get it. I used to think that too. Don't give here. Give somewhere else. I just want you to find financial freedom through generosity. So find something that you love and give to that. Who cares? Just give. I mean, when a church says that publicly, it's hard to continue to think these people just want my money.
Yeah. Just before I go on and ask another question, some brilliant questions in the chat. Can I just backtrack a minute? Did I hear you right? Did you say if we sign up for the masterclass, you're going to give us all a free 3-week sermon series on giving? Man,
yeah.
That's worth the masterclass fee in itself, because that could unlock so much for our churches. That's That's brilliant. Thank you.
Well, and it's one of those bilingual kind of approaches, that where it will show you because it's I mean it's a series I've taught before. How do we do this in a way that is engaging for everyone in the room? That's really the goal of it.
Brilliant. That's so good. Listen, let me push back on something that people have talked to me a lot about in the past. Is I know it's different in the American church compared to the British and Irish church, but certainly like in our churches, no one should know who gives what. It's kind of this closely guarded secret. So if you're saying we should target different people who give different amounts, who should? There's quite a few questions in the chat about it. Should the lead pastor
Yeah.
know? Who should know on the team? Should it just be the treasurer? Is it wrong to declare that kind of? Couldn't it bias you against someone if you know they didn't give much and they gave a lot?
The answer is yes and no to all of those things. Um, I It is different in the American church, but not really, Duncan. The emotions are the same because we're all human. And when we as a pastor learn information about something, about someone that differs than what we assumed about them, that can be problematic. But that's our own sin nature. That's a problem. So we've got to make sure our heart's in the right place if we're going to put ourselves in a position to learn some of that information. Now, here's what I would also tell you. I don't know that you as a pastor need to know individually how much any given person gives unless there's a very specific reason. So I'll give you an example. When we have done capital campaigns for buildings or things like that, and we're going to invite, 10 or 15 families into a behind the scenes closed door meeting because they're the highest capacity givers in our church and they have typically done that, I'm probably going to have to end up knowing who they are. But for that reason, because we're inviting them into that thing. But on a day to day, week to week basis, I don't know that there's a real need to know the names of people who gave this week. I don't know that that's helpful. Now, on the other hand, I think it's also a little bit problematic if we are refusing to engage with the data overall aggregately because we don't want to segment them into the 5 categories so that we can be smarter about our emails and about our segmenting and about some of those things. And so, again, though, you may be, a bivocational pastor and it's you and that's it. So you're going to be the person who needs to know that. If you have a treasurer or a communications person or somebody like that, they can be the one who manages the data list for you. And you don't need to know that necessarily who's in each category. But Duncan, the number one issue is our heart. And listen, I've bumped into that where a person drives into our church in a brand new Porsche. She's been there for 10 years. And then I pull a list for a meeting and they're not on the list. I'm like, oh, I think we missed somebody. And they're like, no, this person's never given to our church. That's the frustration that we feel. That's my own frustration. And I've got to figure out how to deal with that in my heart first. But I'll tell you, the way I learned to deal with it is instead of being frustrated with them, I it's the magnifying glass or a mirror. I just picked the mirror up instead and I said to myself, what have I done that hasn't led them to feel convicted or felt compelled to give to this mission? That's my fault, not theirs.
Let me put you in a scenario. You're a lead pastor on this call, and you're listening to this new idea, this new way of giving, which is more direct, more targeted. It's not just put your sail up and see where God blows us financially. It's being quite specific. It's almost using marketing and businessy language. But you're sitting there going, this seems to make sense. This seems to work. This could revolutionize us. How the big sticking point for you is less about the church. It's more about your elders. How do you go back and sit with your elder board and convince them? You've been going in a certain direction as a bunch of elders where you don't know that kind of information. You should keep that quiet and hidden, and only the treasurer should know. How do you suggest a lead pastor goes back to the next elder meeting and say, hey, I think we need to think about giving in a different way?
Well, again, every context is unique. And so this may not be as easy of a conversation in some than others. However, we've heard a lot like, what are we willing to do to help a person come to faith? Like, how far are we willing to go? I feel like it's a similar conversation. What are we willing to do to help people discover a deeper faith through opening their hands to Jesus financially. I'll do about anything for that to happen. Not because I want their money and I want more revenue, but because I don't want them to spend another day trapped in a financial prison because I have not done everything I can do to lead them to take steps of generosity. So I think I would approach my elders with the heart of discipleship, not revenue. Again, giving is a spiritual problem, not a financial problem. So we want to do whatever we can do to unlock people spiritually. And if that means that we have to segment our active database so we can be more targeted, so be it. If that means that we have to have individual conversations at times, that's okay. Here's the beauty of segmentation, though, honestly, or any of these things. The way that we write emails or speak to people individually, we never go into this and say, I realize that you don't give to the church. Can we have a conversation about that? We walk into these private meetings, even if we know the information, and we say, hey, I'm not really sure how you feel about generosity, but I'd love to talk about why I think it's so important for people like you.
Yeah.
But the reason we're having the conversation is because we care about their heart, not about their money.
Yeah, brilliant. Another question, great question here. Someone's asked about size of church. You know, you talked about 10,000 people on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So
we also did this when we had 200, but yeah.
Yeah. So how, I mean, what size do you need to be in a UK context, do you think, where you can start? If you've got a church of 50 or a church of 500 or a church of 1,000, does it work?
I don't think it matters. If you have a church of 50, how many of those 50 are probably non-givers? If there's two, then we should do something to help them take a first step, right? I don't know that it matters the size of the church. Now, the size of the church will end up dictating maybe your capacity to do email nurture campaigns and some of the things that can happen as follow-ups, and that's fine. But doing part of it, doing something is better than doing nothing. Because again, a church of 50, if you walk out and say, thank you for those of you who give, well, we basically just negated an opportunity to talk to a group of the 50.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think it matters.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I would agree with you. Paul's just said, is the Pareto principle at work here? I've no idea, Paul, what the Pareto principle is. Do you know, Gavin?
I have heard of it. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. So
tell you what, Paul, the 80-20 rule.
Yes. Yeah, that's what it is. I think it's 80-20. Yeah. It is, but every church that I've worked with, and I've done this with, 100 churches now, and by the way, out of the 100 churches, I don't think a single one of them would say that they didn't, again, this isn't the point, but they all grew by 300 pounds in giving. So, I mean, the cost to do this will be made up for in the thing anyway. But yeah, what's interesting is that if we look at the 80-20, in our case, that's what I used to do. Honestly, I didn't literally do 80-20, but I just looked at our church as givers and non-givers. But it wasn't 80-20. I mean, it was somewhere, well, I think about 60% of the people in our church didn't give anything at all. And so it was more like the 60-40 rule. But of the 40 who did give, they weren't all tithers, not even close. So about, 7% were tithers, maybe. And so I think dividing it into more than just two categories is important. My bet would be if all of you cleaned up your database enough that you felt like it was kind of an active versus inactive, and you looked at your active database and broke it down into the 5 categories. I didn't give you the categories for the next 3 segments, or how to break them down. But if you break down these 5, you would not see any sort of 80-20 rule. You would find the biggest group is non-givers usually. The second biggest group are typically more sporadic emotional tippers, and it goes from there, like the funnel almost pictured.
Yeah, that's good. And I know in the masterclass you go into a lot more detail on that. It's great. Good question here from Dan, actually. Thanks, Dan, for asking a question. He's talking about donor fatigue. if you're doing this monthly kind of giving
Yep.
to the community, I know it shows that you're being generous to the community, but then you're talking about a student retreat, and you're talking about a new sound system for the
Yep.
ministry area. You know,
Yep.
how do you guard against like just not talking about money on a constant basis?
Yeah. Yeah. What's funny is that when I was working through all of this for the last 5 years, my first fear up front was donor fatigue. And so, um, but here's how we do it. We're just real smart about this. What we'll do is, let's say over the 12-month cycle of a year, we're not going to do a $4 for the community in December. That gives us 11 of them. We could take two or three or four of those and do something that is a little less outside, a little more inside. So, for instance, student ministry retreat, that could be one of our $4 things.
Yeah.
So there's ways around that fatigue. There's also like year-end giving. I mentioned, that was the fifth thing, year-end giving, fifth idea. How we talk about year-end giving, or just, and for you guys, I know there's not tax issues with this, but how we talk about in December, how do we end well to start well? If you can't start strong if you don't end strong. So what does it look like for us? What is our budget for next year? How can you help contribute to something bigger than you next year through our local church? And here's, we're trying to grow our kids budget by 10%. We'd love to ask you to help with that. So again, I think each month we can figure out what the thing is that we want to talk about. And doing it once a month, I don't think creates giver fatigue. The other thing we got to remember is that people aren't there every week. And so if you were to do this 11 times a year and then 12, if there's a year end December looking to next year moment, um, you're really, you're really probably only hitting people 4 to 5 times max. And the beauty of the $4 for the community stuff is that, I mean, I would tell you, if it was $4 for us, you'd be driving a lot of people away and it would be fatigued. If it's a lot of it's focused on things bigger than you and outside of you, people don't get too upset by that. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that I encourage churches to do in this is to also do some fun things. Like, for instance, order breakfast or lunch for all of your volunteers and tell your congregation that it's a surprise for your volunteers, because it is. And your $4, 4 pounds for the community this month is going to be the tip for the delivery driver. And so we're going to raise money right now. Like, go on the app, go to our website, whatever, like put some money in the bucket, whatever. Every dollar you give toward this is going to go to this person. And then at the end of the service, when they deliver the food, bring the person on stage and give them $250 as a gift. I'm just telling you, it is so hard for a person to feel like, this church just wants my money. I'm fatigued by this. When they are seeing people's lives changed and seeing what they are contributing to.
Yeah, it's more of that sense of I love my church rather than
Yes.
money.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Ricky's asked a good question. I'm going to ask you Ricky's question, then I'm going to ask. I've noticed Chris Porter's on the call, and Chris has done this masterclass with you. So
Yeah.
Matt's just messaged me to say that there's lots of people signing up. So we're running out of spots for that masterclass if you want to get involved. But Ricky's asked a question. Then I'm going to ask Chris to talk about his experience on the masterclass. Ricky said this: should we stop using offering bags, offering boxes, offering trays? Because it's hard to track that kind of data and gather that kind of data when Mrs. Jones just puts a couple of pound into the offering.
Yep.
Yep. What did you do?
We stopped offering bags and buckets, and our giving went up. Here's why. I think you as a pastor, everybody on this call, you're probably better at this than I was. And so I had two things that were a problem every time we had buckets. Every time we passed buckets. One, I always felt awkward. I felt like I needed to make an excuse for the people who were guests or non-Christians or non-church people to help them not feel weird about it. So I always felt like I was having to make an excuse about it. Two, it became a throwaway moment because the bucket replaced intentionality for me. So when we removed the bucket, I immediately lost the tension around the non-church person. Two, it made me become intentional in that vision moment. We called it the vision moment. So for us, it was between the worship set and the sermon. So that's where we would have passed the bucket in the past. And it became a throwaway. Now that we didn't have the bucket, I had to really think strategically each week about how should I talk in this vision moment about generosity and about life change and about the vision and all that. So, in fact, this funding funnel concept probably would not have happened if we would have kept the buckets because I would have just kept it as a throwaway moment. So, um, my guess for you is that if you calculated how much money you get in the bucket giving for the cost that you're paying by doing it, you might discover being more intentional with it and removing that weird moment for the non-church person is worth it.
Yeah, yeah. I just suddenly realized when you were talking actually that demonstrates the difference between a mega church of 8,000 in the States and a church in our country, because most of us would have an offering plate, whereas you have an offering bucket.
Well, trust me, the bucket was empty. Like we could have had a plate too. I mean, we calculated even in our church with 5,000 adults on a Sunday, the amount of bucket past giving was so small.
Hmm.
And if you go back 30 years, people had checks and cash and things like that they were carrying. But we'd be better off to pass a Venmo code than a bucket. We jokingly even talked about like on these buckets, maybe we just put a big QR code on it. We pass it and let's let everybody QR code it because nobody's giving, nobody's walking around with dollars. And here's what we found. Again, I can't spiritually quantify this, but it feels true. If a plate comes by and somebody puts $3 in it, is that I know God can do things with anything, but that's not a journey that they're on. That's just a guilt moment that they probably had, or they feel like they're just checking a box, and that's not the goal.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And the great thing is you've taught us how to dine out of a bucket through Kentucky Fried Chicken as well, which is fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to ask my friend Chris to unmute himself because we are getting people signing up for the masterclass, which is great. And you can do it after the call as well if you want to get those last few spots. But Chris has done the masterclass, and maybe it'd be good for you to hear as well, Gavin. But Chris, when you heard this and you did the masterclass and you started to listen to and put the principles into practice, what happened in your church?
We loved the masterclass. The format of it was just fantastic. Sorry, I'm in the same room as Duncan, so we're getting a bit of echo on that. Okay, let's try that. There we go. That's much better. We got to do the masterclass with a small group of church leaders together with Gavin, and we were facing some particular financial challenges as a church. We really wanted to think through how we were doing giving and how we were asking for it, and it was just an absolute game changer for us. So we still haven't implemented everything in our church. We still haven't gone the full or with segmentation. We've done some of that. We certainly now have changed the way we ask and we make those requests for giving. So we definitely have a particular group of people in the funnel that Gavin's taught us about today in mind when we're making giving requests. And just last year, and we really only started to implement some of the things that Gavin was teaching us last year. We saw a 26% increase in our regular giving last year, and we're absolutely sure that is in huge part down to the implementation of the teaching that we received and the ideas that Gavin gave to us. The masterclass format was brilliant because we were just in a small group, so we could week by week ask loads of questions and try loads of different things and then come back and say what was going on. Gavin kindly, he's already talked about, shared all those resources with us, including the videos of the sessions. So like many churches in the UK, I'm sure our finance people are all volunteers, our treasurer, and then we have one or two others helping with that. So they can't be available during the day, but all the videos were available. So I was able to send them on to those finance people to watch and to do, and they just got it immediately, and they were bought in as well. So once your treasurer's bought in to this idea, then that's just made the whole thing so much easier. We have so much better conversations about it now, and he leads a lot of that. with our leaders and trustees. So that's not just coming from me. So just the whole thing was just a fantastic experience for us. And as I say, we still now are working on things we got from the masterclass that we haven't implemented yet. But just even those small few things that we've begun to do, I've just seen huge dividends for us. So I would commend it. I think it's it's been a great experience for us, and we've seen huge fruit from it. And we also now have the other thing we've done is, because we tried some things, we know what's worked and what hasn't worked. We now have an annual giving plan that we now use in our church all through the year for the different kind of asks we make, for the one-offs versus the regular giving versus the donations to specific external causes and community groups and that kind of stuff. So we now have a calendar that is we can just run every year now, which we're confident will continue to help us with our giving. So it's been brilliant for us, and I'm so grateful to Gavin for the intentionality of thought he puts behind this stuff. Which for me is the big difference between what so many of us are doing, which is it's an afterthought, not an intentional plan. And Gavin challenges us to that intentional plan.
That's amazing, Chris.
Thanks. I mean, honestly, if Chris has seen a 26% increase in his giving, and he's put, a third of what you've taught into practice and still got more to do, then that's phenomenal. So I think it's worth the investment just to do it. Dan's asked the question, will we repeat the masterclass again in the future, because it's too short notice for him? And absolutely, 100%. I'm sure we will. One other question, Gavin, and then I want to talk about the next how-to hub that's coming up, so people can enjoy this kind of content for free and next month as well. And it's a special one, very special one next month. Not that yours isn't special, Gavin. It's always special to you.
No, they're all special, Duncan.
So one of the questions is, it's younger people and younger families. Seem to, people of my generation, I'm over 60 now. We seem to have a little bit more disposable income and able to give a bit more. And it's younger people in particular, millennials and younger families who the budget's tight. It's difficult. How do you encourage them to give? Because they seem to be the demographic in our world that struggle.
Yep. Yeah, well, they're also the demographic that has grown up the most unchurched and spiritually matured, right? And then they're birthing the next most unchurched and biblically illiterate. So it is a real challenge. But as I mentioned earlier, giving is a spiritual issue, not a financial issue. And so if we're trying to ask a young family to go from not giving to tithing, good luck. It's not going to happen. If we're trying to ask a young family to go from doing nothing to doing incrementally something, that's a wonderful opportunity for a first step that can then lead to an incremental next step that leads to an incremental next step. So we got to think of it like that moving sidewalk or a ladder, that we are just working on the next step, knowing that we want to get them as far up the ladder as we can over time, but progress along the journey is the goal, not pace. Whatever pace they have to go at, they go at. I mean, if you have a person who's in debt, who's living off 110% of their income, every year, it would be irresponsible to ask them to give 10% of their income right now. I mean, so again, though, how can we help them take an incremental step towards it? And then we help guide them along that journey.
That's so helpful, because we think about it, it's all or nothing, and it's not.
No.
Just before we sign off, because we are running short of time now, and I'm so grateful for the time that you've given. But I think you might know our next guest in March. Do you know who's coming up in March?
I don't know, but if I know them, I'll tell you all the details about them.
Tell me the details about it. It's a man called Joel Thomas.
Oh gosh, I love Joel. He's a good friend of mine. I love Joel Thomas.
The rumor is he's kind of the future of. I hope this isn't being recorded. Oh no, good. Yeah, the rumor is he's kind of the future of North Point. I mean, Andy's 173 years old now. So
yep, he sure is. Can I give a really quick thing for Joel?
Dude.
Joel was the first intern at North Point Community Church, and grew up working there. Had an opportunity to be a lead pastor in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, here in the States. Went into a church where they said they wanted to be a reaching-oriented church until Joel started making them that way, and they all freaked out. had to deal with all of the leadership ramifications of that, did an unbelievable job helping this church become an outside focus, but also discipleship oriented church, and then has come back to North Point now, during this season that they're in. He is a phenomenal leader, so smart, so wise.
Well, thanks for that endorsement. Joel's coming up on the March the 11th. Matt's just dropped the registration in the link in the chat. It's at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're going to hear the whole of his story, and there'll be loads to take away from that. And so I'm dead excited about that, and I appreciate your endorsement. The other exciting thing about Joel is that he's actually going to be in person in our country in June, along with Lane Jones, because we're doing a national conference in Birmingham, in Halesowen near Birmingham. So the details for that are out already. You can register for that. In fact, Matt, if you can drop that into the chat as well, so people can start registering for that conference and bringing their entire team to that would be amazing. But you'll get a little taster of Joel on March the 11th. So yes, please carry on booking in for the masterclass. We'd love to see you. Like I say, we've been through this with Gavin, and it's probably the most helpful thing I've ever heard. It's so counterintuitive. And it could change everything about your church. So please make sure you book in for that. So unless there's any last minute questions that anybody wants to ask, I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for being part of the masterclass this afternoon. Really appreciate it. We are here to serve the church. It's our mission. We want to help churches grow by reaching unchurched people. So there's anything that we can do to serve you in that event. That's why we've created these how-to hubs, simply to serve you. It's why we've made it free, simply to serve you. So if there's anything more we can do, you've got Matt, if you could put my email address in the chat there. If there's anything that we can do, we would gladly love to help you. But thanks again, Gavin. What are you going on to do the rest of today? What's today hold for you?
I'm just getting started. I've got several Zoom meetings with other churches, and working on some communication, and working on actually some giving work. And so a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, I forget. It's 9 o'clock in the morning for you.
Yeah, 9:17 for me.
Well, have a fantastic day. Thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll see you with Joel Thomas on March 11th. Take care, everyone. God
Thanks.
bless. Thanks, Gavin.